Here we go with part 2 that class I was interrupted with. So, as we were talking about moral development, and remember, it's not the cognitive reasoning or the emotional component that's most interesting, it's the actual behaviors. And so we want to talk about moral development and risky behaviors. We had talked completely about aggression, and now we're going to talk about some of these other ones, such as substance abuse and substance use. In particular, as we had been saying just at the end, when we were disrupted there, these are the rates at which children have, in fact, tried different illegal substances. All right, and clearly these kids are using them. And again, as I believe I was saying just before I ran out of time, there are racial differences in who uses what. Okay? Another issue is the increase in binge drinking. Yes, okay, all right, and kids that do then have. Okay. Smoking, that's right, I was talking about Joe Camel, wasn't I? All right, I did Joe Camel. Blah, blah, blah. Difficulty with self-regulation because of lower levels of cognition, but also because the frontal lobes are not yet fully myelinated. Other factors are runs in families. Oh yeah, look at this. Friends who use substances increase the likelihood of use because they provide a model, an opportunity, somebody to model a chance to get it, access, reinforcement for that behavior, things of that nature. But when it comes to driving, man, teenage drivers are stupid, right? Adolescent drivers are 7 times more likely to be in an auto accident compared to 25 to 29-year-olds. It's really, really bad. They do stupid things. It all comes down to that myelination thing. That the kids, teenage, adolescent drivers just aren't able to anticipate the consequences of their behaviors. They make stupid decisions on the road. Teens are involved in about 12% of fatal accidents. I don't have the number here, but teens are about 4% of the total number of drivers. And in particular, when you talk about the mileage, teens drive like 1% of the total mileage in America. Because when teens do drive, it's local driving. So they tend to drive very few miles. And yet they're involved in 12% of fatal accidents. There are new laws in place to force this. The graduated licensing laws are pretty interesting, where children are required to be supervised, or they're, they must have a licensed driver with them. When I was a kid, that was called the learner's permit. You got that before your license. But nowadays they have things that limit the time of day that the adolescents can drive. They're not allowed to drive between the hours of, say, 9 and 6 or something like that. And also they have some that limit the number of passengers that the adolescent drivers can have. And that makes a lot of sense because some of the riskiest behaviors by adolescent drivers is a result of peer pressure from the other kids in the car and or distraction by the other kids in the car. When it comes to the naughty, which I can't talk about because I'm sitting here in my own home now, and there's kids here, right? 1/3 have had by 9th grade, 2/3 by 12th. We're talking about that. Then the numbers are much, much higher, okay? But of course, most kids don't define that as what it is. Those that don't, they do it not because they don't want to, but because they're afraid of sexually transmitted diseases or damaging their reputation or getting in trouble. But what we find is that for a majority of the activity, it is really a lack of parental supervision, that children often report these activities in their own homes, and it's just that they're not being watched. When it comes to contraception, rates of use are very inconsistent at best. It's we're all guilty, but adolescents are much more guilty of something that is referred to as Superman syndrome, which is this idea that it won't happen to me, it might happen to some other person, but it'll never happen to me. And in fact, it can happen to you, right? And so here is a graph of activity by age as well as by ethnic group. We find pretty large ethnic differences there. 40, almost, not, well, quite a bit, 45% at a low to over 70 at a high, so 35% difference, 25% difference. Why do they do it? Peer pressure, curiosity. Everyone is doing it, right? What are these factors associated with early puberty? We've seen that earlier. Less religious affiliation, poor impulse control. Those things associated with later, the opposite. Oh yeah, what kind of contraception is used? We find that the number of people using none drops with age. The number using any method rises with age. Not a surprise, these two do this. The pill is something which becomes more popular with age, whereas condoms are something less popular as the kids get older, presumably in a more stable relationship. 850,000 teenage girls in America become pregnant every year. Wow, that's a big number. 34% become pregnant at least once before the age of 20. We've had this discussion when we talked about birth and development, and we talked about which children are at risk, and it turns out that this age group is the one that is most likely to have at-risk births, and that is mostly because poverty problems, lack of responsibility problems. As I've told you repeatedly, one of the biggest things with parenthood is you need to stop doing all of those things that you enjoy doing. And teenagers just aren't ready. They haven't yet sown their wild oats, and I can understand that. But now there's a baby, and too late. You have to do it. So babies of teens are more likely to be preterm, low birth weight, all of the problems that we've seen repeatedly that create issues. So here we find the rates of births and problems and complications based on age. Yeah, okay. It's not all negative, though. We can also talk about positive youth development, which would be a perspective that emphasizes how the developing child and their context interact to produce positive developmental outcomes. We could refer to developmental assets. And in fact, if you looked at that slide 2 slides ago, that table that said things that predict early sex and things that predict later, you could probably, in fact, find that the right column, that the one on the right there, probably corresponds quite strongly with this word developmental assets. Those aspects in the environment or experiences that helps the children to thrive. Having a supportive family, having a lot of communication in the family, living in a safe and caring community, peers that model responsible behavior, parents that model responsible behavior. All children have the capacity for positive growth and development. Absolutely. Children are important contributors to their development. What else? Sending them to the community is an essential aspect of supporting positive development. The more positive social relationships a child has, the better the outcome. Not a surprise. There would be a strong correlation if there was some way to quantify developmental assets, and I'm sure there is. If you could quantify developmental assets, I'm positive that there would be a strong correlation between the number of developmental assets a child has and the number of positive outcomes that they have. I'm positive, absolutely sure of it. Pro-social reasoning refers to children's thought processes when they think about helping somebody else. And just like everything, somebody decided that they were going to lay out a theory of development of 5 stages, whatever. Altruism is a voluntary behavior motivated by concern for another or by the internal values and goals. We see that altruism and pro-social reasoning have their precursors. In fact, if a newborn cries in response to the cries of another baby, in many ways this is sort of like the earliest form of altruism. I feel your pain kind of a thing. Yeah, blah, 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 pro-social reasoning. I mean, it's very interesting, don't get me wrong. Mirrors Kohlberg's stages of moral development, sure, and just like we had said with Kohlberg, so much of pro-social reasoning isn't universal per se, and that's because so much of it relies on interactions with parents and other people in the community. Some cultures emphasize religion and spirituality. Religion is an organized system of beliefs, etc. Spirituality is a little bit different. A very individualized search for a sense of connectedness with something greater than yourself. In some of my work, I measure a psychological construct called religiosity. And religiosity is a construct that transcends any one religion. Religiosity is a construct, in fact, a quantitative one that you can turn into a number. And it is basically a construct which is, let's say, for example, you could be high in religiosity if you go to church every week, but you don't necessarily believe what's going on. You definitely have elements of religiosity. Or if you have strong spiritual beliefs, but you don't actually go to church, then there's some degree of religiosity. So we can define religiosity both in terms of beliefs and behaviors, okay? And the highest forms of religiosity are, of course, people that have both beliefs and behaviors. Now, it turns out that this religiosity and spirituality is an interesting thing. I have told you many, many times about the nature-nurture debate. It was like, is this nature or is this nurture? Is it the result of the way the kid is born, or is it the result of what, interactions they've had in their environment? And I've said repeatedly that it almost always comes down very heavy on the side of nature, almost always very heavy. And the more you look at it, the more kind of almost depressing it is to think about what's the point of adopting? Why adopt? If the story is already written, when egg meets sperm, then what purpose do I have in this situation? And so what we find is this is the one psychological characteristic in which parents, or adoptive parents in particular, have the most control, that you can modify the most, more than any other. We find, in fact, the correlation, we had talked about the correlation between an adopted child and their adoptive parents and an adopted child and their birth parents. So we find that the correlation between a birth parent and an adopted child is higher in almost everything except this one. Okay? Religiosity seems to affect behavior and overall psychological well-being, better mental health, less risky behavior, lower levels of stress and anxiety. And in fact, in some of my previous research, as I had said, I talked about my research is on self-control and self-control decision-making in particular as a behavior. And now I'm telling you I'm studying religiosity. And so here's a statement that, check this out, people that are high in this religiosity have lower levels of risky behaviors, okay? And so that's just a statement. So in my research study, what I did, in fact, the title of it was, Why Little Old Ladies That Go to Church Tend Not to Smoke and Drink So Much. That was the title, all right? I basically took this simple statement that they have lower levels of risky behaviors, and I explored why that would be true. It was a very interesting study. I can't get into the whole thing here, but it's around someplace. How can adults foster positive youth development? Oh my goodness. This sounds like something that you need to read on your own. You not aggressive, oh yeah, for solving problems. In fact, it's so massive, there's 2 slides worth. Holy moly. Put them in a good neighborhood. Make sure that their friends are not naughty. Well, finally, we can talk about how can adults foster positive youth development, and as we said, I mean, it goes back to them, what do we call them, developmental assets, or some other thing, whatever, developmental assets, there's a word there. But clearly we can set up situations that maximize the probability that children will turn out fine. That, as the number of developmental assets or good things goes up, the number of positive outcomes in children goes up. I mean, it is correlation, of course. But there are some children, about 10% of children, that defy these correlations. And they're what we call resilient children. That even though they grow up without all of those developmental assets, they grow up without all of those wonderful things, and yet they still turn out pretty darn good. And they're really interesting to study to find out what it is. And it almost feels as though this resiliency is nature at its finest. It's some kids are just born ready to thrive no matter where you put them. Okay, and so we can refer to them. So that's the end of my chapter on moral development. I really enjoy moral development, and I mean I have some other little rants and raves when it comes to moral development, which I just can't get into here because it would just be way too massive for this course. But suffice it to say, in and of itself, moral development is a very, very interesting subject to study. Now, I'll see you in the next chapter. I don't even remember, chapter 12. I think it's on families. I'm not sure. But you know what? We'll know as soon as we get to it. All right? See you next time.